Hello, y'all. Today I'm gonna talk about World War II, and this is a huge, huge topic. I mean, there's no way I can cover everything that's important in this video. So basically, I'm just gonna look at a few things. First, I want to talk about how the Great Depression helped lead to the war. Secondly, just how the war changed the American government. And thirdly, I want to look at how World War II changed America. Like, basically, after the war was over, how did it change our country? And I have a PowerPoint that is in this lesson that kind of deals with how World War II changed America. So when I get to that point, you might want to pause this video and then open up the PowerPoint and just kind of go along with it while you hear the video. So first of all, it's really important to look at how the Great Depression led to World War II. There were a lot of international conflicts that led to the war in Europe and in Asia. But a lot of those conflicts probably wouldn't have happened had there not been a depression. And as you all know, the global depression probably wouldn't have happened without the Treaty of Versailles, or at least it wouldn't have been as bad. Without this depression that devastated Germany, it's very unlikely that Hitler would have rose to power. It's very unlikely that the German people would have supported the Nazi Party if they weren't so desperate. They were very desperate by the late 1920s, but throughout the whole 1920s, really. Early 1930s, things were really, really bad in Germany because of the Treaty of Versailles. People were starving to death, and the economy was just a mess, just a huge mess. And people were looking for somebody to blame that on, and they were looking for someone to help them get out of it. And Hitler provided both of those things. He blamed all their problems on the Jews, as you probably all know, um, and he promised that he would fix the problems in Germany. And he actually did fix the economic problems really quickly. So, as the United States was getting into our depression, Germany was putting the Nazi Party and Hitler in power. And as soon as Hitler came to power in 1932, he began to get Germany out of their depression quickly by remilitarizing. So the Treaty of Versailles basically said that Germany had to dismantle a lot of their military, couldn't really engage in a lot of military production. But as we've seen, military production is great for the economy. It puts people to work. It gets the factories running again. Prices begin to go up. Unemployment begins to go down. So this is what Hitler did. He openly broke the terms of the Treaty of Versailles and started remilitarizing Germany very, very quickly. They were producing tanks, they were producing airplanes, all the things that they were not supposed to do. This helped them get their people back to work. So a lot of the German people were pretty happy about this. They were their economy was doing well again by the mid 1930s, and here in America, we were still in the midst of our Great Depression. So this depression had the effects of not only leading to somebody like Hitler taking power, but it also affected countries in Asia. So Japan was also looking to acquire more colonies because they needed more food. Japan is very small. It's just a bunch of small islands. So they needed more space for food. It's very similar to what Hitler was saying in Germany, that they needed Lebensraum, which is living space. So both of these powers were affected by the Depression, which caused them to start conquering other countries. So Japan invaded China. Around the same time, Germany began to invade Poland, and other areas that had been taken away from Germany due to the Treaty of Versailles. They began to try to get that land back. Um, They invaded Holland, later on France, and for a while, the United States was not really doing anything about it. Prior to Germany's invasion of France, when it was just sort of like Poland, um, people in England and France began to get alarmed, and they realized that they had sort of appeased Hitler for a number of years, that they were kind of turning a blind eye when he began remilitarizing Germany, primarily because they were in the middle of their own depression and they just didn't have the resources to do anything about it. Same thing with the United States. Our leaders here knew that Germany was breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, but we were in the middle of a depression. So people were sort of like, I don't want to have anything to do with that. Let's return to isolationism, which is the idea that we stay out of other countries' issues. So the lesson that we learned from World War I was that we don't want to be involved in world wars. There's an ocean between us and Europe. Let's just stay out of it. So while Hitler was doing all these things in Europe, the United States was kind of letting him, like we were kind of ignoring it because, you know, these reasons I just explained. France and England felt like they couldn't do much about it at first because of their depression. So this is another way in which the depression led to World War II. And it became very clear throughout the course of the war and after the war ended, it became clear to American leaders that economic problems lead to war, that we can't, it's in our best interest to make sure that our allies are not in a state of economic devastation, or our enemies also are not in a state of economic devastation. And this is an important thing to remember when we look at what happened after World War II. So just keep that in mind. World War II, the Great Depression, one of the lessons learned from those things was that peace relies on prosperity. If we want global peace, we have to make sure that other countries aren't on the verge of devastation. So basically, Hitler was able to get away with all this for several years in the 1930s because of the problems of other countries. In the United States, there was a movement to get involved and stop Hitler. A lot of people were saying, we can't let this go on, especially after it became known that the Nazis were persecuting Jews. Some people in America wanted to step in and do something, but others were saying, again, why don't we need to get involved in the world's problems? So Dr. Seuss came up with this really great cartoon that was printed in a lot of newspapers, and it basically depicts an American man in a bathtub, and outside of the bathtub you see Japanese imperialism, Nazis, you see Hitler, you see all these ideas, persecution of the Jews. It's all outside of the bathtub. So the American man in the bathtub is like, he says something like, "Oh, I'm fine. I'm in my bathtub. I don't need to worry about that." So the bathtub represented the ocean, the fact that we're surrounded by oceans on either side of our borders, that there's an ocean between us and Europe and between us and Asia. So people here felt like, well, we don't need to be worried about that. It's not our problem. However, people like Dr. Seuss were saying, yes, it is our problem. For one, this is going to affect us eventually. And two, the Nazis are openly persecuting Jews, and the Japanese are openly persecuting the Chinese, and maybe we need to do something about that. So eventually, in 1940, the Germans invaded France, and England was fighting Germany alone by that time. England had joined the war, and after the fall of France, it was basically just England, and they really needed the help of the United States big time. So President Roosevelt began to try to support England and France against Germany, but without getting us actually in the war. So at first, he sent a lot of weapons, gave them a lot of loans. There were different plans put in place for us to support them without actually fighting, because Americans were not ready to commit to another world war. Eventually, we did, and this was primarily because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So prior to this attack on Pearl Harbor, the leader of England, Winston Churchill, had been begging President Roosevelt for help, for all kinds of help. He really wanted us and needed us to join the war. So in some ways, Pearl Harbor was almost a relief to Churchill because he knew that that would bring us into the war. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about whether or not President Roosevelt knew that we were going to get attacked at Pearl Harbor and he let it happen just to get the American people to support a declaration of war. There's no solid evidence that supports this. However, there is evidence that there's conversations that have been recorded and letters that indicate that our government knew they were expecting an attack from Japan. They just didn't know when or where, but they were expecting this attack because the US government had frozen Japanese assets and had also prevented the Japanese from from having access to several vital materials, including rubber. And this is often, these two things are often seen as sort of like an like a way to provoke war. So after we froze Japanese assets in the United States and prevented Japan from acquiring these vital raw materials, that was kind of seen as like, okay, we are expecting that we are going to get attacked by Japan. But I don't think that Roosevelt knew when or where it was going to happen. But either way, on December 8th, 1941, Congress passed a declaration of war against the Axis powers. Germany, Japan, Italy, primarily. So I am not going to get into the whole war because this would last for hours, but I do want to mention a few important points. Almost as soon as the US started producing for the war, even before we actually joined the war officially, but when we were producing weapons and ships for the war, we got out of the Depression very quickly. So all this war production was really what ended the Great Depression. The New Deal was vital in helping prevent the collapse of the country, and it kind of kept us like afloat throughout the 1930s, but it did not end the Depression. That didn't happen until we started producing goods for World War II, food, supplies, weapons, all kinds of things. Those things were getting our factories and industries back up and running at full force and putting people to work. And this is what ended the Depression. The federal government, once we joined the war, really expanded dramatically. So on the content, the assignment, the weekly assignment page for this week, I put a little graph up that kind of shows federal government spending. And just take a look at that. It's incredible. So the federal government spent $250 million a day during World War II. And that was twice as much as our federal government had spent in its entire history combined. That's insane. The federal budget was 10 times more during World War II than it was during the New Deal. So when people say, did the New Deal work? I always say yes, because the New Deal was government spending, federal spending as a way to get the economy going and end unemployment. And the fact that the Depression ended when federal spending increased by 10 times more than during the New Deal, that's pretty good evidence that federal spending did end the Depression. So it's almost evidence that the spending wasn't enough during the New Deal, that they had the right idea, it just wasn't enough. When the government started spending 10 times more during the war, that's when the economy started to boom. So in 1939, military production provided 2% of our gross national product. In 1943, military production provided 40%. So you see that this basically the entire backbone of this economic boom in the early 1940s was based on war production, federal spending for war production. And after World War II, we had the greatest economic boom in human history. And it was based on war production, which is kind of scary. This is another lesson we learned from World War II, that we need war for a strong economy. And we'll get into that next week, but just keep that in mind. So, couple more things. Y'all definitely need to read the chapter, the Howard's End chapter that was assigned for this week. I'm not going to go over that in this video, so just make sure you read it. But a couple more things that I do want to go over. The Double V campaign. Make sure you read about that in the Howard's End book. It's explained really well, so I won't take time here to talk about it. But let's look at that PowerPoint. I'm going to pull mine up right now, and let's kind of go over it together. So, how did World War II change America? And this first page, I kind of listed some lessons that we learned from the war. First one, science and technology are vital for national security. So there are two things that helped us win this war. One was superior industrial production. So this is the technology part of it. American goods, American industry won the war. And please read more about that in the textbook. Also, science. A lesson learned was science is vital for national security. Why do y'all think that we learned that lesson from World War II? Yes, I'm assuming you said atomic weapons. You'll read about the atomic bomb and watch the American History Crash Course for more information on the atomic bomb. That was the two bombs that were dropped on Japan. But just keep in mind that this won the war. This advanced superior science in atomic weapons ended the war. It wasn't all great. It was extremely devastating, and historians still debate on whether or not it was necessary to use atomic weapons against Japan. And I really want you guys to think about that and watch the American History Crash Course and do all the reading and put all that evidence together. But one thing that we can all agree on is that the use of atomic weapons created the idea that in order for us to have national security, we have to have advanced science and technology. And this is one of the reasons why after World War II, the GI Bill was passed to provide educational opportunities for veterans. And also we have like NASA, a lot of federal spending for technology institutes and scientific research. So another lesson learned from World War II is that we don't need colonies. We'll talk more about this next week, but World War II created this, our need. We don't have to have colonies around the world. We can just have our power and influence around the world. And that will provide us with the raw materials and the consumers that we need. We don't actually have to own colonies. So we'll talk more about that next week too. The third point, peace relies on prosperity. I mentioned already this idea that economic devastation is dangerous for all of us when it exists anywhere in the world. And this would also guide our actions after World War II. The end of isolationism was another lesson learned from World War II, that we can't isolate ourselves from what goes on in the rest of the world. The fact that we waited so long to respond to Hitler and the Japanese, it's kind of seen as a mistake now. I'm definitely not one to, I don't like war. I don't think anyone likes it, but I usually feel like there could have been a different way or a better way. In the case of World War II, I honestly feel like we waited too long to get involved. And especially when we look at things like the Holocaust, there was sort of this attitude that we just don't want to be involved. So World War II taught us that we waited too long. We should have stopped Hitler earlier. And in the future, we must respond quickly and aggressively to international threats. The next thing is, war is good for the economy, which we already kind of talked about, but those were all important lessons learned from the war. Moving on to the next page. So This is just a graph of federal spending that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And just kind of keep in mind that there was a major economic boom during and after World War II. Very much connected to the war. And it brought in the age of the military industrial complex. And this was a term that was first used by President Eisenhower in the 1950s after the war ended. But I want to mention it here because it's really what we're talking about here. The military industrial complex is the idea that our economy is based on war, that our economy thrives when we are producing war equipment, war supplies, military production is the backbone of our economy. And so towards the end of World War II, there was this fear that like, so the war is going to end soon. Are we going to go back into another depression? We have to keep up this war production in order to keep our economy strong. So when we talk about the Cold War next week, keep that in mind. The American century was also based on the atomic age, that we were the only country in the world for how many years? 4 years. I'm not sure exactly how many months. 4 years and a few months. We were the only country in the world with atomic weapons, with the knowledge of atomic weapons. So the American century is the term that people use to describe the fact that America was the most powerful country in the world after the end of World War II. The war also changed the federal government in very significant ways. More power in the executive branch. So the president took on more power during the war. President Roosevelt was elected 4 times. He didn't finish his 4th term because he died before he could finish out that term. He died several months before the end of World War II. But he was elected 4 times. So, and he took on a lot more power than previous presidents. First during the Great Depression, which of course government needed to take more power, and then during World War II. And that's something that has remained with us. The president has more power. World War II also led to the creation of a lot of new government agencies, a ton. So all the ones that did propaganda, the War Industries Board, all these new agencies for rationing, for price controls, for the support of labor, to keep workers on the job. Labor unions were supported as a way to have better conditions for workers so that they stay on the job, because our industry and our industrial production was the backbone of our victory in this war. So all these new government agencies were created to direct all this war production and propaganda, and also censorship. So you'll read about that. But basically, like the CIA was a new agency. The FBI was strengthened. The FBI had been around for a few decades prior, but it became a lot more strong because of the war. So just the growth of government bureaucracy. Also, the definitive end of laissez-faire economics. So we saw that during the Great Depression. The government began to take a very active role in regulating the economy, but people tended to think that was temporary. World War II showed that that laissez-faire economics was over once and for all, that the government would have an active role in regulating the economy. And during the war, of course, it was their role was about military production. So somebody said, I should find out who said this quote, but Dr. New Deal has been replaced by Dr. Win the War. And that just meant that all the money that the federal government was spending during the New Deal, it didn't stop, it just increased. So instead of it being a plan for ending the Depression, it became a plan for ending the war. But it was basically the same idea. The government was behind it. So we also see the beginning of the GI Bill, which we'll talk about more next week. But the last thing here, a way in which World War II changed our idea of government is that we now have this idea that we need government to protect us. And during World War II and the Cold War that followed, this was really a strong idea that government has to protect us. And like we talked about before, at first, in American history, people wanted to keep government small because it was something that was going to threaten our liberties. And then we see during the progressive era, people want more government because you need to regulate capitalism. And then during the Great Depression, there's even more of that. We want the government to help, to provide social welfare regulation. And now with World War II and the Cold War, now it's more of a sense of we need government to physically protect us from nuclear war. So the next page here is, and we're looking at how World War II changed America. It was a kickstart to the civil rights movement. And this is really, to me, really significant and really interesting. So read about the Double V campaign. I'm not going to go over that one because Howard Zinn explained it really well. But other things that made World War II sort of the beginning of the active civil rights movement had to do with a lot of other things. So first of all, as we've talked about before, military service. When African Americans fought in the military, fought for America, fought for democracy, they expected that, first of all, they would have democracy when they return home. And they expected to be treated with respect. They fought for our country. So a lot of these African American veterans coming back from World War II became more assertive about basic rights like voting, or not being part of this white supremacist structure in the South with segregation, and also in the North with de facto segregation. So a lot of veterans returned home and they were ready for equality, and they weren't going to back down from that. They had just fought a fascist regime. They had just defended American democracy throughout the world, and they weren't going to come back and look down when a white person passes them in the street. So, I mean, I think that's fairly easy to understand. During World War II, the federal government began the process of desegregation, and this was super important. As I mentioned last week when we were looking at the Great Depression, Eleanor Roosevelt was very adamant, like she was very active in the civil rights movement and in ending segregation. Her husband personally agreed with her, but felt like he didn't have that freedom to speak openly about this. But during World War II, a lot of African American leaders began to say, if you want our support, if you want us to fight in this military, if you want us to produce for the war effort and support this war effort, we demand desegregation. So they began the process of desegregation. It was very limited. President Roosevelt issued an executive order that said that any industry that has a government contract has to desegregate. So industries with a government contract, that meant like in any industries that were involved in war production, or even food production that was specifically for the troops, so canned food, things like that. Any industries that had a war government contract had to desegregate within that industry. So like Ford produced a lot of tanks, and they during the course of World War II, they were forced to desegregate their factories. So the armed forces, the military was still segregated during World War II. It was a really big issue, and so many people were in favor of desegregating the military, and President Roosevelt was in favor of desegregating the military, but others felt that we can't threaten we shouldn't make any big social changes within the military while we're in the middle of this war. It's just too risky to sort of threaten social standards, cultural standards, while we are fighting this war. So many people felt like after the war we can do this. So it didn't happen yet. The sit-in movement began during World War II, and it mostly was African American veterans who returned home from the war and were unwilling to sit in the Black only section of places like diners, restaurants, things like that. They began to sit in the white section. And this was the beginning of the sit-in movement. Many times they had on their military uniforms and their medals, and they said, I'm sitting here. So we talked about the Great Migration when we looked at World War One, and just keep in mind that that expanded dramatically during World War Two. So if the Great Migration was like this for World War One, it was like this for World War Two. There were jobs opening up in mostly in the West, places like Los Angeles, Seattle. A lot of war production took place there, and millions of African Americans moved to those cities out of the South. New York, still, Chicago, just moving out of the South. And in these places that they moved to, they had more educational opportunities. So when I say this is the kickstart to the civil rights movement, just keep in mind that like a lot of young African Americans moved to Seattle and Los Angeles during the 1940s, and they would be the ones who would have access to better education. And then when they got into college, they would be the ones leading the civil rights movement of the late 50s and 60s. All right, effects on women. We've all seen the Rosie the Riveter posters, but women had a lot more opportunities for employment during World War II. However, this employment was always seen as temporary. It was hard for the federal government to recruit women to work at first because there was the sense that if you're a mother, you should not work outside of the home, that you would be neglecting your children if you did so. So a lot of suburbs throughout the country, they would fly planes over them and drop leaflets. And these leaflets would say like, women, we need you to win. We need you to join, work at this factory. This will help us win the war. It'll help your loved ones come home sooner from the war. It'll help them come home alive. You need to do your part. And women were saying, but what am I going to do with my children? So for the first time, the federal government created daycares, and they were run locally by local government agencies where women could take their children. And they had to convince women that this was okay. Like, you're not neglecting your children if you put them in a daycare. You are doing this to help the war end sooner. So many women did this. They got jobs outside of the home, and they took over a lot of jobs that were like male oriented jobs. So an extra credit option for y'all that I'm going to mention right here is to watch the movie A League of Their Own. That movie is based on a true story, A League of Their Own. I'm sure you can find it on Netflix. And write a one-page paper about how that movie depicts women working during World War II. So women took over a lot of things. In the case of this movie, they took over Major League Baseball. They also took over a lot of bands. There were a lot of big bands that were entirely made up of women. Women began to do all kinds of things, and it kind of empowered them. And towards the end of the war, a magazine put out a poll and asked women, like, when the war is over, do you want to keep your job? And over 70% of the women said, yes, I want to keep my job. Towards the end of the war, when it became pretty clear that we were going to win it, the message going out to women began to change. The message was now, when men return home from the war, be a good citizen and give up your job to the men who are returning home. So it was seen as temporary. I have Eleanor Roosevelt listed here, but God, I could go on about her forever. So I'm going to keep it short and just say that she was an advocate for women's rights and for African American rights and for human rights during World War II and even prior to that. After the war ended, when her husband died, she represented the United States in the first ever United Nations Congress on Human Rights. And she was an ambassador for the United States. And they formulated a Declaration of Human Rights, and Eleanor Roosevelt was a big part of that. So on the next page I have here, another effect of World War II was that it led to the birth of the International Human Rights Movement. This was created it was a result of some of the worst atrocities that have ever taken place in human history, primarily the Holocaust, which we're all too familiar with, and also the rape of Nanking, a terrible incident where a lot of Japanese forces tortured Chinese people, hundreds of thousands. And it was also based on the use of atomic weapons against Japan, which was a really controversial topic. So after World War II, the United Nations was created, which we'll talk about next week, but they really began to talk about international human rights. Um, so a lot of good things happened as a result of World War II. We see the beginning of the civil rights movement. We see a big push for the women's rights movement and human rights. But keep in mind that during the course of the war, there was a lot of racism. It was just mostly directed at Japanese people rather than African Americans. Not that racism against African Americans disappeared, but during the course of the war in America, there was this push for unity of Americans. So people tended to say, you know, whatever color you are, we're all working together to win this war. That did not apply to Japanese Americans. Please read about Japanese internment, and just know that there was really, really severe anti-Japanese racism during World War II. Very violent. Chinese people were scared. A lot of them would wear clothes that had like a sign on the back that would say Chinese, not Japanese. A lot of Chinese owned businesses put banners out in front of the door that would say like Chinese owned, not Japanese, because they were scared that people would mistake them for being Japanese. China was our ally, and so they wanted to make sure people knew that they were Chinese. Time magazine actually had an issue come out where it was supposed to instruct readers on how to differentiate between Chinese and Japanese people. So it had a Chinese man, Japanese man. It had like a diagram of like, look for this, like the eyes slant this way. And it would say like Chinese, good, they're our friends. Japanese, they're monsters, basically. So there was a really severe anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States. And that was definitely part of the reason why we use atomic weapons against Japan. All right, I'm gonna leave it there, and y'all just make sure you do the reading because I did not cover everything that's important. Huge topic. Have a good day.